What is going on, guys? I hope that this video is finding you well. Let me know in the comments if you guys can see me and hear me okay. I want to know that everything is going to be okay on the technical side of things. Also, let me know where you're watching at, if you're watching this on YouTube, if you're watching this on Facebook. Man, really important stuff tonight. It has become so obvious to me how far behind the firearms, self-defense, and martial arts community is as a whole when it comes to the science of skill acquisition, when it comes to the science of motor learning. We are woefully out of date. Now, I'll just come out and say this. I know people are going to get pissed off because they don't like the truth. The firearms community is even further behind. The firearms community, the approach toward training in general is woefully antiquated. So I'm going to be providing for you guys tonight sound clips from the Way of Champions podcast from two of the top motor learning experts on the planet, which is John O'Sullivan and John Kessler. You guys can look them up. I'm not going to give you their whole bios tonight. So that you guys can understand that Todd's not just making these things up. Okay? Todd's not just making these things up out of thin air. Just to give you guys a little bit on myself before we get into these sound bites. I have been involved with as a professional motor learning, skill acquisition, and mental training coach as a professional at the highest levels, elite levels, Olympic, major league levels of sports, professional levels of sports for over 20 years. And we're applying the latest science to what we do here when it comes to a holistic approach toward self-defense. What we teach specifically at WDS is an integrated approach that includes the handgun or force multipliers into our philosophy of personal protection. All right, so tonight we're just going to be laying down a framework where I'm going to be talking about things in a kind of a very broad and general way, but don't, just because they're broad and general doesn't mean what I'm going to tell you and what I'm going to be sharing with you tonight isn't extremely important and very compelling. It is. Okay. If you want to know a little bit more on the details, go to on YouTube, go to our YouTube video entitled Deep and Accelerated Learning, the IDS Approach. And that will touch on more details. But here's what I'm going to do because this is so in depth. I'm going to turn this into a series. So I don't know how often it'll be because I'm in the really super busy season right now. And I pulled this together for you guys tonight because I think it's so important based on some of the reactions, especially from the competition shooting world based on a video that I put out recently, which was awesome because it really let us know where we're at. What was also awesome about the response to that video is how overwhelmingly powerful and positive it was for most people, how in agreement that they were, but also again, let me know just how in deficit the firearms community is in general, but the martial arts and self-defense community is as well. So I'm going to be giving you guys more and more on this as we go. I'm going to sort of be laying this out as a series as we go in the future. And I promise you that I will be getting into in future episodes the science of training scars, also known as slips and capture errors. I will be getting specifically into that science so that you guys understand how to stay away from the pitfalls of training scars and slips and capture errors, because what we're doing with personal protection and self-defense, the stakes could not be higher. They couldn't be higher. We're talking about life and death and going to prison for 30 years or not. Okay, so that being said, I'm going to play a clip for you right away, and I want to discuss it. All right, here we go.
I said, Trev, this is motor learning. This is how you learn surgery. And my surgeon friends would, here's a statement I hope you use later beyond in your clinics. My surgical friends have said things, neurosurgeons say, if I practiced neurosurgery the way I did 18 months ago, I would be sued for malpractice. The orthopedic surgeons and the cardiac surgeon guys, they'll say, if I practice my form of surgery now the way I did just 5 years ago, I'd be sued for malpractice. Well, I offer to your listeners that many of the ways you are teaching now, I should be suing you for malpractice because you haven't kept up on how you learn faster. You're sticking with the old, hey, I learned it this way myself, right? And I'm teaching the way I was taught cycle that we're not breaking out of.
Okay. So the first thing that he said was motor learning is motor learning. Let me tell you a little bit about John Kessler and also some of the work that I've done in the past. Okay. Well, he's best known for his work in elite volleyball. Okay. And the things that he's developed and understood with motor learning. But, and this is true with lots of motor learning coaches, he is hired across all spectrums, from surgery to anything that incorporates motor learning, surgery to being a high level, pilot to military applications, the jobs that people do in industry. He's sought after not just in elite sports, but all across the board. So for those of you who are critical of me for pointing out some potential, what can be pitfalls when it comes to competition shooters, saying, well, what qualifies you to have an opinion about competition shooting if you've never done competition shooting? You don't understand human dynamics. That's a fucking asinine statement and a fucking asinine question. Sorry if you don't like it. But the point is, motor learning is motor learning. Once you understand the science of how motor learning works, you can watch it and you can analyze it and know what it is. Now, some of you might think, well, the example that I showed in that video is a poor example. Actually, the example that I showed is a great fucking example. I have about 500 or 600 friends on Facebook that are competition shooters. So I probably watch between 10 and 20 different videos every single day of people performing during competition shooting. Some of our students are high-level competition shooters. One of my training partners for over 9 years is a high-level competition shooter. I've been there, I've watched it, I have a pretty good understanding of how it works. I choose to use my time differently. I see competition shooting as a supplemental form of training that applies to everything else that we do. So that's the first thing. The second thing that he talked about is how doctors and surgeons, by the way, my wife works in surgery. I'll talk a little bit more about that. My wife has worked in surgery every day since she was 18 years old. Okay, and she trains surgical teams, right? So I know a little bit about how that works. He's talking about how neurosurgeons and heart surgeons and surgeons of different kinds would be sued for malpractice if they were practicing the same way that they did only 18 to 24 months ago. If you think about what we do when we carry a firearm and when we teach people to carry a firearm, the stakes are actually higher for us than it is for them. And what we do is actually far more difficult, believe it or not. I've had in-depth conversations with surgeons and with my wife who works in surgery every day. They'll tell me what you do, Todd, is far more difficult than what we do in brain surgery, because in brain surgery, we control the variables. And the stakes are higher for you than they are for us. So just like John said in his soundbite, he put forward for you, if you're teaching in a way that isn't up to date with what the latest science is on skill acquisition learning and motor learning, it's the same thing as a surgeon being sued for malpractice because they weren't teaching in the most why wouldn't you want to be teaching people in the most cutting edge way? I don't understand this. Is this just straight up ego? Is it straight up institutional inertia? What is it? Why would I trust me, I understand cognitive biases. I can have a whole list of them written down here with my background in psychology if you want to know. I have a whole list of them. Why wouldn't you want to know that? Right? Let's move on to the next bite.
As to methods, there may be a million and then some, but principles are few. The man who grasps principles can successfully select his own methods. The man who tries methods ignoring principles is sure to have trouble.
Okay, principles versus methods. We're going to get more into this. As many of you know, at IDS, we prefer to be principle-based. Why would we prefer to be principle-based? Because principles are adaptable. The analogy that I like to give is that of a key maker. Okay. Let's just say every day I have a new student that comes to class. By the way, we have classes throughout the week here at IDS, a wide variety of different disciplines, and disciplines that are all thrown together. And each week that they came to class, I gave them a new key for their key ring to solve a specific problem that they're faced with. Now, after a while, they'll have this huge collection of keys, and people like that feeling. They like all the keys in their key ring. Like, look at all my trinkets. Look at all the keys I have in my key ring. Look how many problems I can solve. And I could do that. We could do that. But I would prefer to instead teach my students how to be key makers, to understand the principles of fighting with and without a firearm and integrated with a firearm, so they can have a high fight IQ in a moment to take and look and recognize the variables, the unrepeatable and unpredictable variables that they're faced with, and make whatever combination of keys that they need in the moment to solve that problem. One is adaptive, and one is maladaptive. We prefer to have our students be adaptive. So that's the difference between being focused on techniques versus focused on principles. We prefer to be focused on principles. The principles of fighting are the principles of fighting. Doesn't matter if it's a macro war scenario, or if it's in close or personal with a firearm, or if you're in a ring, or if you're in an octagon. The principles of fighting are the principles of fighting. Shooting is not fighting. Shooting is a piece of fighting. Just like if I sat here in front of you today and said, shooting a basketball is the game of basketball. All you have to do is go shoot the. We'll set up different games of horse and trick shots and things, and you go shoot, and that's the game of basketball. Or shooting in hockey is the game of hockey. You would look at me like I was fucking crazy, right? We're going to get more into this, but I just wanted to give you the idea of what we're getting at here, right? Principles versus techniques, and we'll get into how and why in a minute.
So the principles of motor learning include specificity, which means that things have to be, I like to summarize it all into just, you need to train in the reality of what you're going to be performing.
You need to train in reality of what you're going to be performing. We'll get more to the specifics of the specifics here shortly. You need to train in the reality of what you're going to be performing. Is competition shooting reflective of the reality of what you're going to be performing in a real life critical incident? And if you answer the yes to that, then either you've completely deluded yourself, or you're completely unfamiliar with the statistics or patterns of violent crime and what the probabilities of those are, or both. And I'll say the same with martial arts. There's a lot of martial arts out there that don't even come close to being reflective of reality. Most of them don't. Most of them don't train specifically to self-defense. I train grappling 3 or 4 days a week. A lot of times I train with a firearm on. And grappling, like competition shooting, has become a game. It's not reflective. You can go take a look at podcasts that I've been on with Greg Nelson himself, where we're talking about this. You're not on the same surfaces. You're not dealing with 56% chance of more than one attacker. You're not dealing with weapons. You're not, you're going to take somebody to the ground. You're going to choke them out. Now you're using excessive force because you've obstructed their airway, the blood flow to their brain. Someone pushes you to the ground or throws a punch at you, so you take them down and break their arm. You don't think that's excessive force? Have you thought about how you're going to retain or conceal your weapon? You think that that's intuitive. You're dead fucking wrong, because I've grappled with some of the top grapplers in the world and put a gun on them, and their gun gets taken away with them in a very short period of time. You can try to convince me that comparing apples and oranges is the same thing, but it's not, no matter how you slice it and dice it. It's just not. The objective is to train specifically for what you're going to be performing. Specifically to what you're going to be performing. What about, let's just go back to competition shooting for a second. What about the full spectrum between situational awareness, conflict avoidance, and use of lethal force with a firearm? What about all of the connective tissues in between? You know how to retain that weapon you're in close range? What are the most common assaults? Simple assaults. What distances do simple assaults take place at? Aggravated assaults. What are the most common aggravated assaults? What distance do they take place at? They all take place at contact distance. Most violent crime occurs within a 6-foot circle. How are your hands-free skills? And even if you do have good hands-free skills with martial arts, have you trained them specifically in the context? Context dictates strategy of when you're carrying a firearm or other force multiplier. What about the use of force? Are you training the use of force? We could go on and on and on and on and on about all the infinite number of variables that you are not including, that are not included at all. Not to mention the fact it's fluid, that it's not fluid, that it's predictable, it's preset patterns. Even if every stage that you're going through is a different stage, you still have the opportunity to walk through that stage and gain that stage. Are you going through it blind? Are you making all these other decisions? Is it really a match? Is it really a match in reality? You have to ask yourself that question.
But we're fighting back against the status quo of, well, these kids will learn passing by just repeating passing in lines without any decision making attached to it. And it just, like, the motor learning science doesn't back that up for retention and transfer of skills, does it?
Not one bit.
The retention of transfer of skills in the whole of the game of violence. If you're preparing for competition shooting, then you're preparing for the game of competition shooting. I'm all for that. I'm all for it. I'm not against competition shooting, if you want to call it what it is. But the retention comes from the whole. Decision making. I've had conversations with the top coaches in the world. One of my coaches is the top coaches of the world. I've been doing everything in my power to communicate this with the public for years. You can have all the kinetic skills in the world. You can know how all you want. But if you don't have the looks to make those decisions within the nuances, the human nuances of violence, you are setting yourself up for a catastrophic failure. I'm not saying you can't have success. I'm not saying you're automatically going to fail. I'm saying on a long enough timeline, you will. That's what the probabilities say.
Right, they do require this ability to think on the fly and to assess situations, make decisions, come up with solutions, choose the right solution, execute the solution, and then assess what you did and get ready for the next one, all in a split second. And if that's not what our training looks like, then there's no way kids are ready for the match, are they?
Exactly.
There's no way that kids are ready for the match. So they're preparing athletes to be ready for a match or for a game. The stakes aren't even close to what you have to be faced with on the street, especially if you're carrying a firearm. Are you really prepared for that? I've been asking that question almost since the very first video that I've ever put up, since the first seminar. Are you really prepared for that? How much force on force and threat recognition work and decision making and making decisions on the fly and problem solving are you doing? problem solving in a shooting at targets in a static way is a form of problem solving, but it's not the same kind of problem solving. Not even close. Not even close. You're comparing a circle versus a sphere. Actually, more dimensions than three. A circle versus like this, polydimensional, figure. Those things aren't comparable. When we train in the way that we've been training with self-defense with a firearm, we're setting ourselves up for catastrophic failure. That's why it's time for us to take a different approach. Listen, this has been known for a long time. And there's volumes and volumes of peer-reviewed research on this. And in future episodes, I'll be providing that peer-reviewed research for you. But we have to start somewhere. The fact that people aren't paying attention and caring about this, it's extremely concerning.
That these games-based randomized learning, it's not pretty. There's not perfect lines and lots of cones and everything. But when we train ugly, we transfer skill, don't we?
The best.
When we train ugly, we transfer skill, don't we? And then John Kessler said, the best. It's the best transfer of skill. So what does it mean to train ugly? You guys might have heard me post about this or talk about training ugly. Training ugly means that you're failing a lot. You're failing a lot in the decision making because these split decisions are difficult to make. And even within the kinetic skills, this has been well known for a very long time that high level performers fail the most. And they use it as feedback to course correct to increase their level of performance. You're going to criticize people for failing? If you guys haven't noticed, I don't care. I don't give a fuck right now what you think about me. Think what you want with what I'm going to say. I'm just saying all these things because I'm not going to do the world a disservice of not sharing it, because I don't hear anybody else fucking talk about it in our world. Okay? I go live. I train live a lot. At the range, I go live. When I'm here training with inert weapons, I go live. When I'm grappling and training, combatives, or other martial arts, I train live against high-level people because I want to encourage people to fail. And I want people to encourage other people to fail, because the more they fail, the more that they succeed. I've put out a challenge publicly for instructors to show themselves training live and to show themselves failing publicly. One person took the challenge and posted it. One person.
And on a scale of effectiveness, what you're doing, what your coach did 20 years ago, and what we know a coach should be doing today, it's way more effective to do what we know, right? And this is what it is. So we're just trying to help you make the most of your time, not tell you that what you're doing is ineffective. It's just way less effective.
Yeah. That's a good way to make him hopefully hear what information you're giving. And that's the reason for sharing it that way. Now, I know that in my world, specificity is the most important part about learning that we fail to do effectively. One of the most important parts, I hope your listeners hear this, for this to work, it has to be shown by you that you also are not okay with failure, are working on your own growth mindset, that you're going to screw up in the process, and that we trust each other. Therefore, it's okay to do that. I show that I make mistakes and I fail, and how I deal with that is part of what they learn to trust about us, because we're all working on the same deal to be the best team we can be.
Why isn't vulnerability and admitting mistakes part of coaching education for every sport at every level?
Luckily, since the growth mindset research came out by Carol Dweck in 2009 at the U.S. Olympic Committee level, it is weaving into most everything.
So At the highest levels of performance, vulnerability, and the sharing of making mistakes within their communities, from the instructors to students. The students see their instructor also making mistakes and creating a safe environment for those mistakes to happen so they can maximize performance is what's being woven in at the highest possible levels of elite performers. How do I know that? Besides the fact that John Kessler just was talking about it. Well, I mean, I helped coach Rose Namajunas, who is at the top of the top. Is there anybody more vulnerable than Rose about mistakes and vulnerabilities in general? No, no, not at all. And again, he continues to repeat himself on the importance of specificity and the transference of skill from practice to performance. If you're faced with the unthinkable in a life or death situation, it's time for you to perform.
Well, but motor learning training is so specific that it needs to be just like the game.
Again, motor learning is so specific that it needs to be just like the game. So for those of you who are involved in the teaching of self-defense or believing that you're practicing self-defense, just ask yourself the question honestly. Is what you're training as close to the real thing as possible? We all understand that there's going to be artificialities in training. There's always going to be artificialities, and there's ways that we can layer this training to maximize that effect when it comes to decision making, right? Are you teaching in a way that is linear, or are you teaching in a way that is nonlinear? Is it truly conducive to reality? This is what we like to call reality-based training, RBT. Is it truly reality-based training?
The coach who knows why beats the coach who knows how. The player who knows why beats the player who knows how. I didn't do my job because they don't know the why, not just the how. The how is important, but the why is really important.
Which ties back into games-based learning, right? Because the game teaches you why.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Without anything being said, teaches you how.
Why versus how. How often in your training, and even in your performance, is context included in that training? Is decision making that is appropriate to that context included in your training? How often? This is at IDS what we call empty training versus training that's filled with decision making that's appropriate to the context. I've taken a lot of self-defense courses where context wasn't even really addressed. I've been training at a high level in tactical firearms training for over 20 years. It's extremely rare that context is even discussed, let alone the combative skills and all the other intermediate skills. Martial arts, it's very rare that context is discussed. If it is, it's usually around some kind of a game that points are involved. I'm fortunate that I have the best coach in the world who does include context, but the vast majority of places that you're going to go, context is excluded. And I'm sorry, but in competition shooting, the context is competition shooting. The decisions of life and death aren't included. The context is the game. You're preparing for the game, not the context of violence. Those are two very different things.
Science has shaped everything we do in the gym in terms of developing players. We're training to perform and not to drill. All of the science tells us that the most learning comes when practice looks like an actual game, which is really random and just not super controlled. That governs everything we're doing in the gym. We're making every second in our gym count as much as possible to get the most transfer we can get.
super random and not controlled, because the variables in violence are random, unpredictable, and unrepeatable. Sports are too. The majority of sports are random. So is your training randomized? Is what you're doing and preparing for randomized in a way that is consistent with the realities of violence? Not the realities of the game. We're talking about self-defense now. We're drawing a comparison between what he's talking about in self-defense. Are you preparing your mind? Are you getting the looks? I could really get into the neuroscience on this, but I won't bore you with that tonight. And if you guys want to know about that, leave a comment or start asking me some questions and I can dive into that a little bit. But these things are not comparable. Is your training randomized that is consistent for what you're preparing for?
Sounds like to me you're practicing for practice and not for performance. And that's what so much of your listeners do. They practice to look good in practice and not to perform. And what Karch said earlier is, we're going to train ugly because that's going to help us perform better in the game.
I'm going to play that again.
Sounds like to me you're practicing for practice and not for performance. And that's what so much of your listeners do. They practice to look good in practice and not to perform. And what Karch said earlier is, we're going to train ugly because that's going to help us perform better in the game.
Are you, just ask yourself this question honestly, are you practicing to improve your practice, or are you practicing to improve your performance? When I see competition shooting, I see it as a form of practice. And I see a lot of people preparing for practice because the transference is very little, just as you've heard the experts talking about this whole show, because those variables are not reflective of reality. If you're a self-defense instructor, ask yourself that same question. How consistent with what you're doing? Do you want your students to look good for the practice, or you want your students to be able to perform when they need it to the most? This is the first question that I ask myself whenever I teach somebody. What I'm going to teach them today, is it something that they can use and apply immediately when they leave here? I'm not even getting into the science of retention. And look, again, if you guys get a chance, go look at, the video that I put out in the science of accelerated learning and skill acquisition. Deep and accelerated learning. We have a video on YouTube on that. I'll keep doing more with this. But I got to be honest with you, that's what I see. We have very clear strategies that we employ here at IDS, and we're continuing to improve those strategies so that we are preparing for reality as much as possible. Talking to firearms people, I hear it all the time. Well, they say, nothing beats live fire. Really? Really? Nothing beats live fire. So how far are you willing to take that? Nothing beats live fire? You know how limiting live fire is? One, just the practical side of it. The time that's required for people to go to a range, the limits that are imposed to them at their range, the cost, the expense, not to mention all the things that they can't practice with a live weapon, that they can with an inert weapon like a SIRT, that they can with an LTA, a non-lethal training munition like simunitions or UTM or airsoft for that matter. The list goes on and on. Really? Who told you that? Who told you that nothing beats live fire? What if you started with inert weapons like a SIRT, and the 90% of your practice with the SIRT, 5% of your practice was with UTM or simunitions and airsoft, and then 5% of your practice was live fire. So that way you could work in 3 dimensions with real resistance and real reality and real variables. There's a high level of transference that's happening. right? And then you can take the skills that you do want to use and practice and rehearse with live fire to just to reinforce and validate those skills. That's what we do at IDS. The autonomic nervous system doesn't know the difference between a simulated experience and a real one. It doesn't. So you can build all the competence and all those kinetic skills with something like a SIRT pistol or with a non-lethal training munition, and then go validate it at the range. Again, with real resistance, integrating combatives and all the other fluid and dynamic decisions that go along with it.
Sounds like to me you're practicing for practice and not for performance. And that's what so much of your listeners do. They practice to look good in practice and not to perform. And what Karch said earlier is, we're going to train ugly because that's going to help us perform better in the game.
Okay. So I have a video here that I'd like to drop in, but I want to hear, it's a video that's an IDS video, linear versus non-linear training, that sort of speaks to this same concept. I'm checking the comments here. Any comments or questions from anybody? Okay, so I'm going to play this video right now, and we'll see where it takes us. Check it out. So I'd like to talk about why we at IDS prefer non-linear training to linear training. IDS stands for Integrative Defense Strategies. So let's just take a look real quick. So I'm just going to draw this line on the board, and this line represents linear training, okay? So with linear training, I'm putting everything into one clear, specific vein. I'm putting all of my eggs into one basket. And as I grow and improve, eventually I'm going to max out. There's only so far that I can go when I practice linear training. An example of linear training would be shooting, right? As I grow and as I progress with my linear training, eventually I can only go so fast. Eventually I can only be so accurate until I'm putting all of my hits into one hole, right? And everything's happening at the speed of light. That's all the faster that I can go, right? Powerlifting would be another example, right? Powerlifting. Eventually, I can only lift so much weight. Eventually, my mechanics with power lifts can only be so good. That would be a linear approach. So let's just say, for example, that as you were training and practice shooting, for example, and that linear approach to shooting, that you reach the 90th percentile. Let's call this 100th percentile, 0 percentile, 90th percentile. Let's just say you reach the point where you hit the 90th percentile. In order for you to go from the 90th percentile to the 91st percentile would require an astronomical amount of training time and practice, all right? And we all know just how precious our training and practice time is. So now you're training and training and training and training to go from 90th to 91st percentile. When in reality, when we take a look at the statistics, when we know that the average distance of a citizen defensive shooting happens at 9 feet, how good do you really need to be? That doesn't mean that we don't recommend that you practice. We do at IDS. We practice shooting every single day, but we understand that there are limits, and we're intellectually honest with ourselves that there are going to be deficiencies if all we do is practice our shooting, because in the totality of the circumstance, when it comes to violent crime, we know that when it's best to use a firearm and when we're justified to use a firearm is really just a very thin slice of the totality of the circumstance. So does it really make sense for us to spend all of our time and all of our energy just on that thin slice in one thin linear vein? Or would it make more sense for us to instead take a non-linear approach? This is what we consider a non-linear approach, a holistic approach, where we have multiple disciplines that are all being
interdependent with one another, and all of these ingredients for a non-linear approach are all getting baked into the cake together. Some examples, right? We have the firearms, or what is called a force multiplier for now. We have combatives, weapons-based combatives. We have tactics. We have use of force. We have use of the psychology, the science of skill acquisition, legalities, and decision making. And we could add more and more circles to this, but just for the illustration of the point, we want to take all of these components and make sure that we're not putting everything just into one, but that we're distributing the time that we're using with our training and our practice for personal protection among multiple disciplines, because we know that when it comes to violence, that the variables are unpredictable and that they are unrepeatable. Right? So we need to have multiple disciplines so that we can be very adaptive to what those circumstances are. All right? So we want to ask ourselves the question, in an objective reality, what do you think is going to be a better approach for your personal protection? A linear approach or a non-linear approach?
What do you guys think? What's going to be more effective, a linear approach versus a nonlinear approach? What do you guys think about what these experts have been saying on motor learning? How important is it? If you haven't, if you're tuning in late, go back and watch it from the beginning. Let's see what we got. Vernon says nonlinear. If you see it another way, that's okay. You're welcome to see it that way. But I think that we have to agree that one doesn't match reality. I hope. Here's one more.
Let's talk about shooters versus defenders, because that's what I do. Shooters deal with set variables and set patterns. With shooters, there is no context and things are pre-choreographed and predictable. An arbitrary and quantitative reality, it is cookie cutter, standardized, and linear with no combatives. Shooters are typically taught by presenters who utilize outcome-based training, meaning they basically teach to the test. This is an unrealistic kabuki theater. Defenders, on the other hand, deal with random variables because they understand that the variables in violence are unrepeatable. Therefore, they employ context within their training and they utilize adaptable principles. The defender's reality is a qualitative reality. It is unstandardizable, it is non-linear, and it includes combatives, ideally integrated combatives. Defenders are typically taught and trained by coaches who cultivate skill over time. They utilize a performance-based training model that gets the most out of each student's unique set of attributes and unique set of circumstances and lifestyle. This is a reality-based approach, and it saves lives. Shooters versus defenders. Which one are you?
Shooters versus defenders. Which one are you? All right, guys. So for whatever it's worth, I'd like to thank you guys for watching. For tuning in late, go back to, I'm going to recommend going back to the very beginning of this video and listen to what these experts had to say about motor learning. And ask yourself the question, if what you're doing truly is maximizing your motor learning skill in proportion to the stakes. that you're faced with. Thanks, guys.